Shall we get started?
Yeah. So welcome to our panel. Thank you to everybody for coming. So we're talking about fan history and does anybody care? I think it might be prudent to reframe that question a little bit and say instead, what is valuable about fan history? Why is it relevant? And why ought people should care? Because it's true that people do care about fan history. It might not be a super mainstream topic, but there are people here at this panel. There are researchers all throughout fandom and historians who spend a great deal of time collecting and curating the history. And there are people who read and appreciate the works of fan history that have been produced by all the historians and collectors throughout the years. I think that the story, that fan history is really the story of the genre of science fiction and the community of people who are fans of the genre. Um, why does it matter though? Well, the reason fan history is important is because modern fans still grapple with the same questions and issues that early fans grappled with. These questions are fundamental and they're timeless and they don't have answers. The answers to these questions are conversations that are still relevant and interesting, I think, to any fan and reader of science fiction today. Since sorry, feel free to butt
Yeah.
in
So
if you
well.
have
So
any.
Dan. So yeah. So maybe we should do some introductions.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So let's. But I think you've done a good job of teeing up the question, right? So and what we really hope is to make this interactive. Um, and I think we have an August longtime fan, author, and publisher in our presence. So Jean Marie, do you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll talk a little bit about our project as well.
Well, I consider myself to be what we used to call in the old days a true fan with the E left off the end. And I went to my first con. I started reading sci-fi just about the time that sci-fi hardcovers were beginning to come out. And I remember when there were only 1 to 2 sci-fi paperbacks issued in all of America every month. And and I went to my first con in around 61 at the age of 16, which dates me pretty well. And at that con, I discovered about fandom existed, and boy, was I excited, because in those days, science fiction was not taught in schools. It was considered a trash literature. You couldn't even write a book report on it and get any credit. And it was a proud and lonely thing to be a fan then. And so as I like to say, literally ran away from a totally loving, supportive home to move from Sacramento to Los Angeles to join Losfus so that I could hang out with my people. And so I could talk to somebody about the things in my head, about what Heinlein was talking about, or what Asimov was doing, or all the other writers who had something to say, or about, one of my earliest teen gods, because I think I first read the real start of the Lensman series, Gray Lensman, in book form at the tender age of 10 or so, and I had to be with. It was like not having air to breathe, And I had this desperate starvation to hang out with fans and talk to them. And of course, when I discovered fandom, I discovered fanzines, and slowly along the way, I discovered one day that not merely were there science fiction digests, which I bought every one of every month, but that before that, there had been these big size things with colorful covers and really cool stories called pulps, science fiction. And I started to collect that when I read my first really Brackett story in a pulp. And I do publish sci-fi still, and I reprint a lot of older pulp and some new writers, and I love it all passionately.
Great, thanks. And a notable author as well, by the way. So do credit where credit's due. So I think we'll touch on at least one of your books as we progress the discussion here. So please, folks, chime in with questions and comments as we go. So my name is David Ritter. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I have been a science fiction fan for a long time, but came to organized fandom quite late in life, and which is something that I regret. But was introduced to science fiction through some of the very early, stuff that was written in the 1930s. So Doc Smith, Jean Marie mentioned the Lensman series. I started with Triplanetary, and the sweep of that really kind of swept me up. and Lovecraft were sort of my two initial, passions around that. And then later in life, I wanted to explore the early writings of those folks, and so I started collecting early Smith and early Lovecraft, and got into the pulps, and I discovered this thing called Cosmos. So Cosmos was this serial novel that was written by 17 different authors, orchestrated by a group of fans. Starting in 1933, 1934 with Science Fiction Digest and Fantasy Magazine. So Ray Palmer and Julia Schwartz, who were Mort Weisinger, who were the primary editors of that magazine, cooked up this scheme basically to get free content for their magazine. So they solicited a bunch of professional science fiction authors of the day to write this serial novel. So Ray Palmer wrote up the outline of a plot, this grand epic space opera plot, invasion from another solar system, and all kinds of twists and turns, and he farmed it out to all these professional authors and basically asked each of them to contribute a chapter. The whole thing came together as you might imagine, as a bit of a hash. I wouldn't suggest it's a great piece of literature, but what it did is it established that magazine as as a credible sort of organ for fans. And so Science Fiction Digest and Fantasy Magazine, through that period in the mid 1930s, really became, I would say, kind of the organ of fandom, the most prominent one. And through those relationships and through that work, Ray Palmer went on to be the editor of Amazing. Julia Schwartz went on to be an editor at DC Comics for decades. Mort Weisinger went on to be the editor of Thrilling Wonder Stories and published extensively through many decades. So many of the active fans in those very early days really drove and built the science fiction industry as we know it today through the course of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. So that became really sort of a fascinating story for me, and I indoctrinated my children early on. So Daniel's my middle son, and I subjected them to Doc Smith and others, in their early days. And we had this notion that maybe other folks would be interested in understanding the richness of history that came out of 1930s fandom. So we launched this project, and with a couple of great collaborators, John L. Coker, who is the curator of the first Fandom organization, Sam McDonald, who's a librarian at Rutgers University. We formed this collaborative publishing project, and over the last year and a half, we've basically tried to assemble as much as possible the original material that came out of that period that was generated by fans. So this is the fanzines and the other publications that drove fandom in those days, and the very first conventions that started with a dozen people and grew into the 1939 Worldcon, which was the first significant Worldcon, and now has led to the conventions and the fan gatherings that we know today. And last year, we published a book which turned out to be like a 500-page tome. It's called The Visual History of Science Fiction Fandom, and really compiled a lot of this history. As part of that, we really started to try to understand the nature of fandom and activism in fandom, and what does fandom really mean? What should fans, could and should fans do with their interest in science fiction? What should it motivate them to do other than read more science fiction? As an escapist form of literature, it's awesome, but is there more to fandom than that? And so we've been kind of rolling around in that question and trying to understand it, and also really try to understand, what does it mean to today's audience? Is there a relevance to fan history for today's audience? So that's what we kind of want to talk about today, bring some ideas to the table, but really open it up. Love to hear about folks' experience in fandom, how it's affected your life, has it changed the way you interact with society, the way you think about the future, the way you aspire, your idealism or a fear of a zombie apocalypse. How is it really affected, and how does it relate to your day-to-day life? So with that, I'll kick it back over to Daniel and to lead us through a couple of questions.
Right. Yeah. So there's a poignant example from history that I thought would be fun to share to kind of kick this off. As David mentioned, we spent a lot of time thinking about this question. That it's not a question that we are posing for the first time about science fiction. It's a question that fans have been asking themselves about science fiction since the very beginning of organized fandom. Questions like, what is the purpose of science fiction, and what is the role of fandom in society, and how does science fiction and fandom relate to each other? These questions kind of became a vehement topic in fandom in the mid to late 1930s. As some of you may be familiar with, the Futurians and Donald Wollheim, and these fans who kind of took it upon themselves to be a little more vocal in what they thought about these questions. So I wanted to share a video. It's about 3.5 minutes long, but it's excerpts from a speech that Donald Wollheim gave in 1937 called Mutation or Death. And I'm going to try to set that up to play real quick. And I think this is a good launching point because this is kind of Wollheim talking about these two questions directly. What is the purpose of science fiction? What does it mean to be a fan? He has very strong opinions on this, and they come out.
Right. So this was at the Third Eastern Science Fiction Convention, which happened in New York, and was a gathering of, I don't know, 30 or 40 of the most prominent and active fans of the day. And so you get a sense of what the conversation was like. And I would say the speech certainly stirred up a bit of a hornet's nest, which had future implications, which we'll talk about.
Can you see my video screen here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me know if the audio doesn't come through. Here we go.
Mr. Chairman, members of the convention committee, visitors, and friends. To open this discussion, it would be well to put forward a statement pregnant with meaning, a statement heavily loaded with dynamite and fraught with shaking possibilities. The science fiction age, as we have known it during the past few years, is over. Dead, gentlemen, of intellectual bankruptcy. Naturally, such a statement calls for proof. Need I offer any more positive a proof than the conduct of this convention itself? Gentlemen, we are gathered here this afternoon to do what? My opinion is that we are baloney bending. I see before me fans, writers, editors, and publishers, STF fans all, and but a handful really awake to the enormous possibilities inherent in that fragile little thing called science fiction. That potentially mighty force which is rapidly being buried in a deluge of obscure issues, meaningless phrases, stupid interpretations, and aimless goals. The very fact that no single science fiction organization has ever made any lasting impression on anything speaks for itself. Just where has science fiction got to in 6 or 7 years of loosely organized existence? On a world scale, nowhere. Locally, practically nothing has been done. Fandom has resounded for almost a decade with the hullabaloo and the shouting, and now the hollow shell of a structure stopped suddenly in headlong growth sounds to nothing but a painful silence. But why not give science fiction a meaning? Today, we are face to face with the choice: civilization or barbarism, reason or ignorance. As idealists, as visionaries, we cannot retreat before this challenge. Science fiction must mutate, must change into a new form of idealism, a fighting, practical idealism based on actions and not words, on experience and achievements and not on bombastic and irrelevant swaggerings. The main point of this whole discussion is that you fans must prepare to incept this new state of things. Else nothing is left but a slow, gradual decay of the gaunt corpse of the body of STF until it disappears. It is our job to work and plan and prepare, to teach and expound for the coming of that day when the human race shall stand erect, as should a man, and gaze on the stark, naked cosmos with firm eyes, to feel the solid, inconceivable impact of the grim void, to flood its consciousness with the realization that in the vast emptiness, we must stand on our own feet and fight it out. Therefore, be it moved that this, the Third Eastern Science Fiction Convention, shall place itself on record as opposing all forces leading to barbarism, the advancement of pseudosciences and militaristic ideologies, and shall further resolve that science fiction should, by nature, stand for all forces working for a more unified world, a more utopian existence, the application of science to human happiness, and a saner outlook on life.
Right. So the comment from Edmund in chat is civilization or barbarism. It sounds like he was trying to quote German communist Rosa Luxemburg, but backed off. Well, Donald Walheim during this period was in fact a dedicated communist.
Right.
He was a member of the Young Communist Party and attended communist meetings, and as did a number of other of his contemporaries. Frederick Pohl, who we know as a prominent science fiction writer over the years, actually edited the newspaper of the Flatbush Society, the Flatbush Artery, which was the Young Communist Party newsletter during this period of time. They grew out of that. Similarly in Los Angeles, the science fiction fans there that were in their nascent organization. So we're talking here about Forrest Ackerman, Ray Bradbury, and the crew around them. They took on to they became quite enthusiastic about this ideology called technocracy, which was essentially, let's put the scientists in charge, right, and let them run the government. And there was, in technocracy, there was an idea of a universal basic income, which was based on energy credits, but the fact that society should be able to sustain everyone to at least a minimum level standard of living. I guess you think about all these fans at this time, they were all basically teenagers or early 20s, and I've heard it said somewhat cynically that, if you're not an idealist when you're 20, you have no heart, but if you are an idealist when you're 30, you have no brain, right? Where did all this youth and fervor, go? Most of it went into long professional careers as editors, publishers, and writers. But this notion of activism in science fiction certainly has carried through to the day, and it's come in fits and starts to some extent. So if we bookend all the way forward to today, I suspect most of you have heard Janet Ing's acceptance speech for what was at that time called the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer at the last Worldcon, where she basically started off by saying, John W. Campbell, for whom this award is named, was an effing fascist, and went on to basically, describe how he, from her point of view, suppressed free thinking and had a very narrow view of what constituted science fiction, and is known to have been a bigot, and have said some very bigoted things. And so here we see young science fiction fans and writers coming forward with ideas to help drive change today, and many examples in between. And so really, I think the question we pose is, are there lessons from fan history that should inform us today? How should we think about the role of fandom in science fiction today, and in society today? And should it move us in some way to action, either to aspire and work towards a utopian future, as some science fiction envisions, or to avoid a dystopian future that some science fiction envisions?
Right. Yeah. And Wolheim and the Futurians were very much in the camp of, the science fiction is about figuring out what the future could look like in positive ways, and trying to demand fans kind of stand up or work for that future. They were responding to a world that was on fire at the time. In 1937, when he wrote this, the Spanish Civil War was getting on. There was war in Asia at the time. The shadow of World War II was there. People were looking at what was happening, and they were already seeing that the world was going to descend into chaos. And they weren't typically people beating the drum of war. There were people who were looking for alternative solutions. And I think that that type of thinking is something that I feel like is common across the whole history of science fiction, but particularly today. When people are looking at the system and saying, there can be different ideas that can be on the table here in order to address these systems that we have. I think that fans, by and large, are often much more receptive to those ideas, and innovative in how they can think about adopting those ideas.
So, Jean Marie, how do you think about this in terms of your involvement in fandom and the way that you've portrayed that, and the way that it's affected the way you think about your role in society?
Well, that's a good question, but I would like to respond to a couple of things. One, of course, was statements that science fiction would quickly wither if it didn't, fulfill its purpose as having some great social relevance, and you can see how quickly it withered and how limited it has remained in the hands of only a few hundred or a few thousand readers still to this very day. Yeah, right. And so science fiction it's like a child. Science fiction, 6 years into its existence, was like a child at some stage, and you don't know what your child is going to be like, but what you do know much later, much later, is that you can't form what that child is going to be beyond a certain level, and it's just going to go out and be itself, and that may not be what you wanted. And certainly, and I was also thinking of I'm going to go blank. The person who wrote Bulwer Lytton? No. Anyway, I'll skip past that because that was right in my head then. But there were a lot of utopian novels already being written by very passionate writers who were trying to use what we call science fiction today, or even speculative fiction, to influence people, and passionately trying to influence people to go in one direction or another. Wollheim is very interesting because he started out a communist. He partly got over it, but I don't think he ever stopped being a socialist, because as late as the end of the 1960s and I think into the early years of the 70s, until Terry Carr kind of busted his chops, he continued to publish the pulpish science fiction novels of Robert Moore Williams, who was still a pretty passionate communist. And for an example, you could read his book, done for Ace Books. I don't think it was ever reprinted. The Blue Atom. But typically, industrialists were the bad guys, and typically workers like miners and so forth were the good guys. And while I pretty much agree with the speech about Campbell, he was not really trying to corner people's thoughts and turn them in a direction, because it's very hard to explain why in the late 60s and 70s he published continuously short stories and novels by another arch communist, Mac Reynolds, in which the main character, bad guys, are generally giant corporations who fight their wars by hiring mercenaries who they sacrifice for their own personal and corporate gain. This doesn't seem a lot different than what we're happening today, but without the mercenaries, and who was at that point passionately advocating for a universal living wage, and totally the opposite of what Campbell believed. I always thought that he was open to anybody who could make a good logical case for whatever they were making their case for. He would publish them whether he agreed or not. He certainly tried to get his writers to stir them into writing controversial things and thinking about things in a different way. I think, like Heinlein, he was kind of a gadfly whose major purpose was just to get people to think, not to think what he thought, but just to think about the issue. I always remember how I wandered around many years, for months, after reading Heinlein's little aside that, fines were not a good way of punishing people because they fell disproportionately upon the poor and not the rich, and that maybe we should go back to the whipping post because, the lash hurt everyone the same. And I'm pretty sure that's not what Heinlein actually felt in real life. But I know I and many others wandered around thinking, well, what would be good? And looked for yet alternative ways of justice that would fall proportionately upon everyone. And I think that science fiction itself is, in some ways, has been a kind of radical force for change, because after you've read some, you begin to think about everything, and and you think about alternatives. It gets your brain thinking about alternatives. It makes it very flexible, and it makes you look at the future and the present and the past in new ways. And I think what with due respect, is it John Michel who wrote that speech?
Yep.
Yeah, what he missed was that science fiction itself was the very thing he was trying to put his finger on. That it wasn't any one philosophy, because every philosophy has a downside. I like to say neither a communist nor a capitalist be for reason often loses self in isms, and to science fiction, and no one ism is always right. No one idea that came from a little 3-pound human brain in this gigantic universe was ever found 100% thing that would work for everybody. But science fiction helps you think and challenges you to think with every next sentence. I think thinking is that force.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's in response to Michel and this notion of activism, there's a cartoon. So Jack Spear was another prominent fan of the day, and these folks went back and forth and challenged each other in their fan publications, and he drew a tiny little cartoon that has a robot with a giant sword who's chasing after a human being, and the robot is saying, "Are you the guy that said let us all work to see that the things we read in science fiction become reality?" So this notion of driving the right kind of conversation, I think, is really a key one, right? So hopefully science fiction remains a place where lots and lots of ideas can come together and be exchanged in ways that allow us to explore and imagine. And that was the notion that what can be imagined can be accomplished. So I guess there's a role in trying to set aspirations, not just for technology, but also for what can evolve from a society standpoint in terms of the implications of that, both positive and negative.